Chapter 19 of Consequences Part 2. Crouching low, Anna stopped to catch her breath. She was taking shelter in a small storage room on the 4th level, a windowless little cube hemmed in by stone shelving. Rolled-up maps were crammed into the available space, and a few tin crates along one side gave her cover from the door. Voices and hooves rushed to and fro in the hall outside, calling out orders and responses.
Kitchen's clear! Kitchen's clear! Checking wall room! Team set at the bottom of north stairwell!
Anna grimaced as she raced to build a mental map of the patrols. It had been hours since the alarm was raised, and the initial chaos of 100 bluecoats rushing through the halls had since given way to careful, methodical searching. They'd split into teams of 5, much too large for her to take out quickly and silently, and began clearing the keep from bottom to top, voices echoing off the stones with every report. Rear security teams moved up as the rest searched, ensuring she couldn't slip past them and out to free them, drawing an ever tighter net upwards through the keep. She doubted her ability to evade them for much longer. A sardonic smirk tugged at her lips as she listened to the commotion in the halls. Even if she couldn't find a way out, at least she'd be able to say it took 100 trained troops to hunt her down.
Stop thinking like that, stupid filly.
She shook her head, dislodging the dark thought.
You're getting out of here. Who knows, Gava won't survive a month without you watching her.
Now, if she could just figure out how, she'd feel a lot better about her situation. She stiffened at the sound of hooves stopping just outside the door. A voice called out, muffled by the stone, but still alarmingly clear. "Checking map room!"
Buck.
She scanned the room, considering her options. The ceiling was out. The soldiers had started looking up as soon as the knowledge of her thestral nature reached them. She might be able to squeeze herself into one of the crates, but she'd probably have to empty whatever was inside to do so. There wasn't time to try and do that with any trace of subtlety, and she'd most likely end up doing the hard work of capturing her for them. No, she was already in the best position, crouched down behind thin tin like some street urchin seconds away from her first lashing. Talking or fleeing wasn't an option. Anna thought back to a panicked sailor begging for mercy as she reached a hoof to her arcata, slowly pushing it out to avoid the distinctive click. Some pony was going to die, and it was not going to be her. The door burst open, filling the little room with the clang of its impact on the stone as the soldiers started rushing in. Anna crouched low, setting her jaw. If she waited for them to find her, she'd be gunned down in an instant. They'd be most vulnerable as they entered, when the narrow doorway split the group in two. She rounded the corner, letting loose with the most monstrous screech she could muster. There was only one soldier fully in the room, and he paled as he suddenly found her sliding past his bayonet. Behind him, the second soldier froze in shock, stumbling forwards as her peers bumped into her. A shot rang out as Anna plunged her arcata into her target's chest, the twin blades sliding between his ribs and spearing his heart. Dark blood spewed from his lips as he fell, rifle barrel trailing smoke. Shouts of alarm filled the keep, pounding hooves already converging on the gunshot. Anna didn't spare them any thought. The second soldier was just hitting the ground as the third made it inside, struggling to turn her body and bring the length of her weapon to bear. Anna pounced, smashing the mare's side against the doorframe and cutting up into her gut. With a quiet sigh, the mare went limp. The first soldier rolled to her hooves, screaming her fury as she charged Anna with her bayonet. With her arcata still lodged in flesh, Anna was forced to duck, hissing at the pain of the steel grazing her neck. She pulled a knife from her vest with a wing, stabbing it up into the mare's throat. and the scream turned into a gurgle. Anna's eyes snapped to the door. The last two soldiers had opted to step back instead of trying to rush her, leveling their rifles at her through the doorframe. Their trigger strings were already in their mouths, their eyes hard. Anna grit her teeth as she used her trapped Arcata as a lever, bringing the body wrapped around it up like a shield. 2 shots rang out, and she winced at the twin thuds of lead balls sinking into the dead mare's flesh. The soldiers screamed, and she screamed back. She barreled out into the hall, using the body as a battering ram. A bayonet burst through the corpse an inch from her face. Another punched through and sunk into her shoulder. Anna gasped as she threw the body forwards with all her weight, ripping her Arcata free and sending both soldiers tumbling back beneath it. White-hot pain flared in her shoulder, and with a quick glance up and down the hall, she saw a rank of troops on either side, forming up to fire. Charging either way would be suicide, and falling back into the map room would give her only brief respite. Hissing in pain, Anna jumped off the corpse-tangled ponies in front of her and squeezed through the nearest window. The rapid crackle of a gun volley was soon followed by what felt like a kick to her flanks, but stopping to assess the damage would likely mean death. With 2 legs wounded, Anna used her wings to push herself up the keep's facade, clambering onto the roof with a desperate gasp. To her relief, there were no soldiers waiting for her, but she knew she wouldn't have long. She could already hear iron-shod hooves pounding in the stairwells, racing to the top. Flying free wasn't an option. Even with several seconds head start, a rank of seasoned bluecoats would be able to knock her out of the sky with well-placed fire, and if she somehow managed to escape their range, the valley was full of airships and guns that would gladly make further attempts. Her heart pounded against her chest, pumping warm blood down her chest as she scanned the roof. Her eyes widened as she picked out a small airship moored on one of the keep's 3 towers. It was a little thing. A skiff, designed for a crew of 2 or 3 at most. A single dormant propeller was set into the rear, and a spotlight leaned out over the prow. The entire construct was made of thin, dented metal, little better than the tin of a peasant's pantry, and suspended by frayed rope under a patchwork balloon. It was barely worthy of being called an airship. But at that moment, a half-inch of cheap metal to put between herself and some bullets was exactly what Anna needed. She gnashed her teeth as she pushed herself farther, scaling the tower's rounded sides. A bang and a shout from beneath her announced the arrival of the first bluecoats on the roof, and she pulled herself towards the outer side of the tower, wincing as another volley of gunfire threw chips of sharp stone against her face. Anna crested the tower to find a shivering nettle-kissed soldier on top, hooves devoid of any weaponry as he clutched a notepad to his chest. She bared her fangs at him, and he dropped the notepad with a whimper, rushing to open the trapdoor beside him and disappearing down into the tower. She pulled herself onto the little skiff with a groan, wincing at the feedback on her wounded shoulder as she cut the mooring rope with her Arcata. It began to drift immediately, swaying in a gentle wind. Anna turned to the controls with a grimace. A simple wheel allowed her to angle the propeller to either side for turning, and an exposed crank behind it would let her power it.
Fantastic.
Anna muttered as she limped over and put her weight on the crank.
Just had to be a hoof crank.
She leaned forwards, pushing the crank down and biting her tongue to hold back a whimper at the burning pain in her shoulder. It lurched into motion with a ponderous clicking, lethargic at first, but settling into a ragged rhythm as the worn coils wound tighter. The propeller sputtered into motion a couple seconds later, and a strained grin graced Anna's face at the feel of the wind tugging at her mane. "Form up!" Anna stiffened. She poked her head out over the edge of the hull, looking down to the squad of bluecoats filing out into the yard outside the keep. Ready! As one, each soldier swung a foreleg out, bringing their raised rifles down into firing position. Aim! Anna backed away from the edge, scanning the little boat's deck. A metal crate was set into the center. She peeled the lid open, spotting the annotated maps and rubbish stacked within, and then slammed it shut before rolling on top. She pushed herself down against the cold metal, squeezing her eyes shut. Fire! The crackling cascade of gunfire was almost immediately drowned out by the sound of heavy lead balls crashing through the ship's thin hull, all around her. She flinched as a round parted the hairs of her tail, and again as another burst through the chest she was using as cover, shattering one of the thin bones at the end of her wing. She wheezed at a sudden punch to her gut, one hoof flying down to grab the fresh bullet wound and staunch the bleeding. And then darkness. She was a filly on a strange wooden airship, marveling at the sails that cast their shadows over the open deck like giant wings. Coarse feathers, feeble with age, curled over her shoulders, shielding her from the stiff wind of travel. She looked up, cuddling into the dark plumage of the griffin that she called Dad. And he smiled down at her. Anna fluttered her eyes open, simultaneously marveling at her continued life and pointedly ignoring that there was ever any possibility of her death. The air was still, absent of the shouts of bluecoat sergeants or the popcorn reports of their rifles. There was only the ragged tick of the ship's little engine, the stuttering whir of its propeller, and the rush of the blood in her ears. She clenched her jaw as she rolled off her makeshift cover, fighting back a giggle. She wasn't home free yet, and she really didn't feel like disturbing her growing list of wounds with manic laughter already. She checked herself first, looking down to the dark stain on the belly of her vest. Pulling her hoof back, she was relieved to see the base of a blood-stained bullet jutting out of her, having failed to penetrate any further. As she had hoped, the extra layers of the thin metal chest, plus whatever had been stacked inside, had sapped enough energy from the round to prevent any deeper injury. Grabbing a knife and a wingtip, Anna gnashed her teeth and jabbed the tip into the wound, hissing as she pushed the round free. It fell to the deck with a high-pitched clink, bounced once, and fell overboard. After taking a moment to bind her wounds in ragged cloth from her bag, Anna turned her attention to her ship. The engine and propeller were still functioning, at least as much as they had before the volley, though the engine was already running out of what little energy she had imparted. She limped over to the crank and began to push, winding the coils tighter once more. It was only when she felt the gut-wrenching sensation of falling that she bothered to look up, groaning as she saw the fluttering tears ripped into the ship's little balloon.
Fuck,
she muttered.
Sweet Luna, it's always something, isn't it?
Peering down over the edge of the hull, she saw the ridge of the valley passing beneath her. From above, the network of trenches on either side of the crumbling wall looked almost like the scribblings of a board full. They cut the land like scars, curving around rock outcroppings in mismatched rows connected by narrow, jagged paths. Soldiers in nettle-kissed green milled between them, some propping their rifles up between piles of dirt, while others took what time they could to relax. In front of the trenches was a wide expanse of hoof-churned dirt, thinly spread trees shading the bodies, orange, green, and even a couple blues scattered beneath them. The bushes and flowers were all but trampled into the ground by the repeated passage of soldiers, leaving only low-hanging branches to serve as any kind of cover. And it was these trees, Anna realized with rising alarm, that her little stolen airship was about to crash into. She flared her wings, vision flashing white at the pain from the shattered bone. Flying was out of the question, but she could still pull off a clumsy glide. There wasn't any time to spare waiting for a break in the trees. With a prayer to Luna and a deep breath, Anna took the 2 steps to the edge of the deck and jumped. The ship hadn't been moving all that fast by most standards, but her injured wings still threatened to buckle under the sudden pressure. She gnashed her teeth and focused on keeping it extended, trying to tilt it back and slow her fall without overwhelming the weakened limb. The shrill screech of breaking metal echoed across the sparse woods from behind her, but she didn't dare look back, lest she throw herself into a roll she'd have no way to recover from. Luckily, the trees weren't very tall. She was only a couple dozen feet off the ground, meaning she could reach its safety in seconds. It was just a matter of getting down without smashing into one. The lingering momentum from the airship pushed her into a tree side on, halting her midair. She clutched onto the tree as hard as she could with 3 wounded limbs, avoiding any damaging bounces. Slowly, she slid down, plopping onto the flattened grass at her back as she hit the bottom.
Ow!
A moan escaped her. She blinked and was startled to see the sun jump an inch across the sky.
Eyes open, Philly. Don't pass out now. You're almost there.
She was so close. She had made it out past the Frieslander lines with her stolen cargo intact. All she had to do now was get up, find her bearings, and make her way back to Alta Lucia. If only her limbs weren't so sore and her chest wasn't so hot. She licked her lips as her eyelids began fluttering down. She had added 3 more bodies to her name. Surprisingly few, considering the circumstances. That made 7 total since she had started counting. 7 kills in nearly as many days. How odd that she should suddenly become so conscious of the lives she took during such a bloody week. Hoof steps approached her, and with a concentrated effort, she mustered the energy to tilt her head to the side. More soldiers, wearing the orange colors of Duke Titus, their eyes wide with curiosity.
Finally, some good luck,
she thought as she settled back into the grass. Titus was working with Whitehorn. He would help her. She just had to hope his troops weren't superstitious enough to finish off a wounded Thestral they found on patrol. It started slowly, much like the snow. Rarity couldn't see much from within the cell. It was a damp, cold affair, lit only by the slivers of pale moonlight that filtered through the bars set high on the wall. Snow dribbled through at a glacial pace, collecting in the corners before congealing into a reflective, silvery mush that made it quite difficult to lie down anywhere but the very center of the room, which was raised ever so slightly above the edges. No matter which way she faced as she and Pinky cuddled together for warmth, there always seemed to be a stiff wind blowing from the most uncomfortable direction, slithering in past her scarf and cloak and stealing the heat from her body before shifting the instant she adjusted. Rarity was reminded of the thrilling romances she used to read and while away the days with during the slower seasons of Carousel Boutique. How many times had she read of the dashing hero being entombed in a dungeon, much like this one, withstanding the villain's torture with only the thought of his beloved to keep him sane, biding his time until he could escape and come to her rescue at the last possible moment. Or in the more exciting stories, until his beloved could use her own wiles and charms to set him free herself. The books would always talk at length about how cold the dungeons were, but Rarity had mostly skimmed these dreary descriptions, eager to get to the breathless pining and promising that always preceded the inevitable escape. Just then, Rarity was mostly pining for a blanket thick enough to keep the stone from sapping what little warmth she had left in her. She was roused from the shivering dreariness of her attempt at sleep by the heat of sunlight, and she couldn't resist the urge to rear up and peek out the barred window into the courtyard beyond. 2 ponies, stopped outside of her and Pinky's cell and seeming more curious than upset, peered past the snow that clogged the slim barred window and whispered between themselves. Their eyes widened as they met her gaze, and a blue coat stepped forth to ward them off. They came back minutes later, now as a gaggle of 5, and she noticed one wearing a patchy white scarf around his neck.
Rarity?
Pinky groaned as she pushed herself off the floor.
What's going on? I'm not quite sure, Pinky,
Rarity said.
We seem to have some visitors.
The Watchers didn't go undisturbed for long. The blue coat returned, now with a friend, and shooed them away once more, the stern threat in her voice clear even as the wind carried the words away. Their guests backed off with rude jeers, disappearing from Rarity's sight. Rarity dropped back down with a sigh, returning to Pinky's side.
Do you think it was rash of me, what I did at the guild hall? I don't think it matters,
Pinky said, scooting over to make room on the little patch of stone they'd kept dry with their bodies.
Somebody had to speak up, right? I suppose. It felt so right in the moment, but now I find myself having second thoughts.
She shivered as she curled up against her friend, drawing her cloak close.
Maybe it's just the cold getting to me.
Pinky let out a quiet giggle, and Rarity blinked in surprise as a furry hoof booped her on the nose.
It's definitely the cold, Rare Bear. It'll all work out in the end. You'll see.
Rarity couldn't help but smile as Pinky began to hum a cheery tune. And after a minute of listening, Rarity found herself humming along. She closed her eyes, warmed by their friendship, and began to drift off to sleep. Or she would have, if not for the sudden commotion at the window.
Pinky, dear,
Rarity said, nodding towards the window.
Would you mind terribly giving me a little boost? Sure.
A brief shuffling of hooves later, Rarity perched unsteadily on Pinky's back as the party pony straightened up, raising her high enough to crane her neck and get a clear look through the window.
Oh, heavens! What is it?
Pinky chirped, peering upwards.
Oh, wait, I can guess! It's dark! It's a snowball fight! It's nearly a riot!
Where once there were only 5 ponies, there were now dozens. They stomped and scraped their hooves, leering and shouting at the squad of bluecoats, shoving them back with harsh warnings. Many of the protesters wore white cloth around their necks, though only a few had proper scarves. Most wore torn strips of rag, blanket, or curtain, the old fabric wrapped haphazardly over the weathered coats and cloaks they wore for warmth.
Countess! Countess!
Rarity nearly fell backwards as Riverpie suddenly skidded into view, crouching low to beam at her through the bars. Her pink cheeks were rosy from the cold, and the fog of her breath danced with excitement before her.
Oh, River!
Rarity let out a sigh of relief as she regained her balance.
Should you really be here, darling? I don't think I'm supposed to have visitors. Hi, River!
Pinky called.
Hi, Pinky!
River squeezed up against the bars, letting her smile back at Pinky before returning her attention to Rarity.
Not much time, Countess. I hear your trial's to be today, but don't worry. We won't let anything happen to you. Trial?
Rarity blinked, glancing over to the crowd as an outburst was met with shouting from the soldiers.
What's going on over there? Those ponies look furious. Aye, we are.
River grinned as she brandished the white cloth wrapped around her neck in a huff.
I went and told the others what happened, and we got just about the whole city on your side, Countess. If they want to take that to the courthouse, they'll have to go through us first. What? No!
Rarity shook her head firmly.
I don't want any fighting, and certainly not over me. I appreciate the support, darling, but that support must not shift to violence.
River blinked. Her grin faltered, giving way to confusion.
But then, how are we supposed to help?
Hey! Stop! River jumped, glancing towards the sound of galloping hooves to her side. She turned back to Rarity, rushing through her words.
If that's how you want it, that's how we'll do it. Take care, Countess. Why don't this go to plan? We'll get you free soon enough.
With that, she was off, leaving Rarity to look out at the growing crowd and watch as a pair of bluecoats ran past her window in pursuit. Someone in the crowd hefted a pole, a white curtain tied to the end, transforming it into a simple flag.
Hey, I want to turn,
Pinky said, wiggling her shoulders for emphasis.
Come on, get down.
With one last grimace, Rarity climbed back down to the damp stone. Pinky pushed herself back with a giddy grin, reaching a hoof over to detach herself from her wheels, when the metallic groan of a door opening caught their attention. Urgent hooves preceded Captain Piaf's arrival outside of their cell. The mayor's smile was strained, dark bags hanging under her eyes.
Morning, dear hearts.
A grim-faced blue-coat stallion stepped up behind her, keys jingling in his hooves.
Rough night? I'm afraid so, though it looks like we weren't the only ones,
Rarity observed coolly. Piaf nodded. The cell door opened with a ponderous creak, and she beckoned with a huff.
I trust you won't need an escort, at least to the front door. After you.
Rarity kept her head high as she walked out of the cell. Pinky's wheels clattered along behind her, only to come to an abrupt stop as Piaf swung the door closed.
What? Hey!
Pinky protested.
I want to come! Sorry, Pinky, but you're not the one on trial here.
Piaf shrugged.
Yet, anyways. I'll be sure to bring your Countess back in one piece. It's all right, Pinky,
Rarity said, giving Pinky a warm smile.
Your company is marvelous, darling, but I believe we'll have to part ways momentarily.
Pinky pursed her lips. At length, she stepped back, looking away with a heavy sigh.
I'll be waiting.
Rarity could spare only a moment to look after her friend before Piaf gave an insistent nudge to her flank, starting her up the corridor. She remembered the path she'd been guided down after their arrival last night, and it was no trouble for her to retrace her route up the steps and through the halls towards the tower's entrance. Soldiers shot her weary glances as they passed, some curious, others contemptuous, but she ignored them all. A squad of 24 bluecoats was crammed into the foyer, rifles raised to the ceiling as they stood at attention. With a glance back from the sergeant and a nod from Piaf, they opened the door and filed out in 2 columns, forming a pony shield that stared impassively at the gathered protesters waiting outside.
Let's go,
Piaf said. She lowered her voice as she leaned into Rarity's ear.
And I'll have none of your rabble-rousing here, love. One wrong word and we'll have blood on our hooves.
Rarity nodded.
You have my word with regards to that, Captain.
The derision from the crowd doubled in strength as Rarity stepped out into the sunlight, squinting past the brightness to see all the faces contorted in anger. They wore the clothes of work ponies and laborers, clothes that Rarity had rarely seen in the streets outside of dawn and dusk. How many of them had gathered here, shunning the jobs the besieged city's rulers clearly deemed so vital to its continued survival. Was it 100 yet? More? It was impossible for her to see the exact extent of the crowd past the press of bodies. And press they did, surging forwards into the line of bluecoats before being thrown back like waves washing off a rocky shoreline. Their shouts overlapped in an indecipherable chaos, filling the air with an anxious energy that made Rarity's hooves twitch with every step. Looking up, Rarity saw ponies peering from the shadows of second-story windows and balconies, pointing and discussing among themselves. Some of them disappeared into their homes before returning seconds later, hanging bedsheets and curtains from their windows like banners. Others shook their heads in silence, slamming their windows shut, or continuing to watch with undisguised contempt. Rarity knew from experience that a pony walking with purpose and energy could cross the courtyard in under a minute. With the jeering crowd interfering, it took the little island of blues several times longer. She felt almost like a weary sailor at the end of an ocean voyage, when the courthouse finally loomed before them. Its bricks were painted a stark white, with shimmering blue banners hanging proudly from the walls. A marble statue of Princess Luna frowned down on Rarity from the left of the tall wooden doors, while a far more motherly statue of Princess Celestia stared at her across it. A small flower garden stretched out to either side of the steps, hemmed in by a short stone wall. A thick line of protesters stretched across the opening in the wall, blocking their passage. Every one of them wore white around their necks, their hooves dug into the thin layer of snow that had gathered overnight. Piaf stepped forwards, clearing her throat and speaking in a loud, commanding bark that seemed at odds with her usual relaxed demeanor.
Step aside, citizens! This is city business!
All around them, the crowd grew still, the shouts fading into an angry buzz as the onlookers seemed to hold their breaths. River Pie stepped out of the line, her voice firm, but strained.
We refuse! The Countess has done nothing wrong! That's for the court to decide.
Piaf narrowed her eyes, cocking her head.
Who even are you, Baron Lander? Did you get lost on the way to the siege camps? What's the matter where I come from?
River countered.
You have the wrong pony, Bluecoat. It's Cart Marks that's betrayed this city, and the Countess is speaking for us when no pony else will. That,
Piaf repeated,
is for the court to decide.
She raised her voice, turning to address the watching crowd.
You should be glad that we don't imprison every one of you. This city is under siege, and you imperil everyone within its walls with your tantrum. The question of Mr. Marks will be resolved once this crisis has passed, but right now, we must remember what separates us from the Barons.
She spat the last word with surprising vitriol, jerking her head in River Pie's direction.
Justice and due process, and unity against outside threats. Friesland has been a stubborn thorn in the Baron's sides for centuries, and we didn't do it by bickering among ourselves with an army at our gates.
Quiet murmurs passed through the crowd, and Rarity could see shame reflected in some of the watchers' eyes.
You call this unity?
River yelled, drawing their eyes to her.
You sit behind your towering walls thinking you're better than us. What does a Frieslander see of their hours of work and toil, eh? At least a Baronlander peasant gets to eat the grain they grow with their own hooves.
Cheers of agreement rose from the crowd, forcing Piaf to shout over them.
I am not here to debate with a Baronlander playing revolutionary. Step aside now. Or what?
River squared her stance, her raggedy scarf fluttering in a passing gust.
You're gonna arrest us? You don't have enough room in your dungeons.
Piaf pursed her lips.
That may be true,
she admitted quietly.
but we'll see how many we can fit.
She turned, nodding to the watching sergeant.
Clear a path. Detain as many as you can.
The soldiers stepped forwards without hesitation, faces grim as they advanced in lockstep. They moved in pairs, half cordoning off the courthouse entrance while the rest began to bring ponies to the ground. The protesters seemed stunned at first, Benny watching in disbelief as the Bluecoats tackled them down one by one, wrapping their victims in rope before moving to the next target. Then River Pie reared up, bringing her hooves to bear on the nearest soldier with a vicious snarl. And the spell was broken. The protesters within the cordon surged forth, advancing on the Bluecoats with cries of fury. The soldiers fell back, working together to bludgeon the uncoordinated rebels and restrain them while they lay stunned in the snow. But they were outnumbered at least 3-1, and it was clear to Rarity that they couldn't keep it up forever.
Wait! Stop!
She turned to Piaf, who was watching the chaos unfold with a grimace.
Captain, this is madness! This is order, love,
Piaf said tersely. She met Rarity's gaze as the ponies outside the cordon grew more agitated, pushing against the line.
It's what's kept Friesland alive on an island full of enemies, and it's my duty to sustain it.
Rarity lowered her voice, putting as much urgency into her words as she could.
You're fighting a losing battle, don't you see? You can't possibly win this. And if I gave even the slightest hint that I believed that, my ponies would be torn to pieces.
Piaf hissed.
Commoners respond to authority and nothing else. So if you want to avoid any deaths today, you will work with me and get your pretty blood past that line the instant a hole opens. Let me talk to them,
Rarity offered.
I can tell them I'm going of my own volition. They'll listen to me. Them listening to you is exactly what's gotten my city into this mess, dear heart.
Piaf spat.
You are not the voice of authority within these walls, and your attempt to usurp the governor is the very thing that you're being judged for.
A gunshot rang out. The city fell silent, turning to watch the wounded stallion fall. The world slowed in Rarity's eyes as she took in the battered Bluecoat mare standing protectively over a fallen comrade, her rifle barrel trailing smoke. With a start, Rarity realized she recognized the injured stallion. Twinkle Smith hit the ground with a soft thud, blood swelling past his scarf and staining the white fabric an ugly red. The gunshot hung in the air, echoing through the streets almost as if to challenge the great cannons lining the distant walls. Twinkle Smith grimaced, the hat sliding from his head as he writhed, and then disappeared behind the protesters rushing to his aid. Rarity looked to Piaf, catching the captain's eye, and they came to an understanding.
Stand down!
Piaf jumped into motion, advancing on the soldier that had fired her weapon.
Rifles up! Private, drop your weapon! Corporal, find me a corpse mare!
At the same time, Rarity turned to face the crowd watching in stunned silence from the other side of the cordon of nervous Bluecoats. She could already see muzzles twisting in anger, but if she spoke quickly, she could stem the flow before it spread out of control.
No more violence!
She cast the words out without hesitation, clumsily, pushed on by the dread of what might happen if she paused to think.
No pony here wants to be hurt, and no pony wants to hurt one another! There's no need for any more pain here today!
They shot that pony! A stallion's voice, angry and hot, rose up from the crowd, the speaker buried in its depths.
And you have every right to be upset!
Rarity said. She looked from pony to pony, trying to impart the weight of her words on each one.
His name is Twinkle Smith, and I consider him a friend, but more violence will only lead to more hurt friends. I am willing to give the shooter forgiveness, but it and all my efforts since arriving in this wonderful city will be for naught if we start a bloodbath here today.
She scanned the crowd pleadingly, raising her voice.
I come from a land where ponies knew each other as friends before all else. Where mistakes once made are forgiven and forgotten. Where ponies live together in peace and war and poverty are nothing more than frightening stories we tell our fools. And I am trying to bring that magic to you, but above all else, it must not be through violence. What would you have us do, Countess?
A mare in the front row mocked.
Ask politely for better lives that the city has made clear it has no intent to provide? Bow and scrape and beg as they turn the snow red with our blood? Are you really so thirsty for savagery?
Rarity snapped, meeting the mare's glare.
Did a single one of you even think to ask what I wanted before coming out here to try and impede my trial?
She let the words hang for only a moment before pressing on, driven by a surge of heat inside her.
I came willingly to the dungeon and willingly to this courthouse, and I will not have any more blood spilled on my behalf!
She was breathing hard, both stunned at the unexpected force in her voice and relieved by the wide-eyed expressions looking back at her. The anxious energy that had just been threatening to overflow had faded, replaced with a startled mix of guilt and confusion.
Countess?
Piaf's voice drew her attention, and Bertie looked back to see the path to the courthouse cleared, the protesters and bluecoats watching each other with suspicious glares from opposite sides.
Let's go, before they find something else to get upset over.
Rarity followed the captain up the path at a brisk trot, glancing back to see the bluecoats falling back into a tighter line, blocking any further entry. River Pie and the other protesters that had been caught in the brawl watched her go in silence, before being absorbed back into the crowd, Twinkle Smith's limp form suspended on their backs. Piaf held one of the old wooden doors open, beckoning Rarity in before shutting it closed behind them. The tumult of the city and the hundreds of watching eyes were cut off by a soft click, leaving them in oddly serene silence as Piaf led Rarity inside.